You are listening to the Get Global podcast, a weekly journey into the international business landscape with leaders, knowers, and doers from around the world who share their stories and insights on the issues that matter most. Get Global brings you the best to help you thrive in foreign markets. Welcome to the Get Global podcast. This is Julian Luthold, the founder and CEO of Get Global, and we are joined this week by Witney Schneidman. He has nearly 40 years of experience working across sub-Saharan Africa and has had many appointments in senior roles from the State Department, World Bank, think tanks, and his own consulting practice. He is currently a senior international advisor at Covington. Welcome, Witney. Tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Julian, it's nice to be here. I'm an Africanist. That's the essence of who I am. I also play the guitar, have 2 kids, married, but really a long time ago developed a fascination for the continent, and I'm fortunate that my vocation and avocation are closely aligned.
So how did that start for you?
Well, actually after high school, I knew I wasn't ready to take the next step and go to college, so I took a year off. And I made my way to Israel and then down to Kenya and hitchhiked up to Uganda. And I happened to be in Uganda when Idi Amin took over the country. And I heard him come on the radio, announce that he'd taken it over and he was going to liberate it from all evil and imperial forces, and borders are closed until further notice. And for somebody who was 18 years old, 3 months out of Radnor, Pennsylvania, it was a big eye-opener to the fact that the world was very different from the one I grew up in.
That's amazing. So first of all, wow. And then how'd you get out of there? What did you see? What happened?
So borders opened a week later as one of the first convoys out, went back to the youth hostel in Nairobi, then went down to the Kenya coast, took a boat to India, came back overland through Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, down the Black Sea to Istanbul, Amsterdam, London, and home, back to Philadelphia. And then I started college. Then I was ready for college.
Had you traveled like that before, or was this just innate for you that you just picked it up and went?
It was, I had never traveled like that before, but, I'd gone away to boarding school. But the deal was I was going to go to Israel for 6 months and then travel in Europe 3 months. But I met these kids in Israel that had grown up in Kenya, and just their stories about game parks and hippo pools and the endless beaches down on the Kenya coast captured my imagination. And I went to the library at night in the kibbutz and got out the map of Africa and saw I could get down to Kenya, and from Kenya I could get home by June like I told my mother I would. So it all fell in place pretty easily.
Wow. So outside of the amazing moment in history that you saw with Idi Amin, what were some of your other perceptions through your initial adventures?
I felt really comfortable in Africa. I felt really comfortable with the African personality. I was fascinated by, on the one hand, it seemed so immediate, but on the other hand, it was so foreign to me. And to try to translate it into my own mind, I found very fascinating. The land, going from Nairobi to Kampala, I was in a truck, we were hitchhiking, and there was a sign that said escarpment. And I thought to myself, what's an escarpment? And all of a sudden we came over this huge rip in the earth, and there's the vast Rift Valley, and you're just waiting for dinosaurs to walk on the scene. And as I said earlier, down on the Kenya coast, this intermixture between the Arab dhow sailing from the Persian Gulf and Oman with the trade winds, staying on the Kenya coast for 3 or 4 months to collect building materials, ivory and gold, and then going back. That interaction between the Arabs and the Bantu, that created Swahili. And it was just so evident there in the people's facial structures, the architecture, the food, the clothing, the breezes from the coast. And I just found it immensely alluring and something that I wanted to be involved in for my life.
So then what happened? You made that decision.
So I made that decision. So I came back, started college, right? And I started taking courses on all these places I'd been. I'd never really been a strong student, but now I had a reason to go to college. Did the India history course, the African anthropology course, but there's no African politics course. So I designed one myself on Africa's transition to independence. And at the end of that, a light bulb just went off. And I said, this is what I want to do. I realized that this continent is ending one historical era, colonialism, and it's embarking on a new era, independence. And being in the coup, I'd seen that change happen. And I said, I don't think most Americans realize how dramatic this continent is. I don't think people realize how important it is and how important to the rest of the world it is. And I want to be a bridge between the U.S. and Africa. And then I said to myself, and one day I want to run U.S. policy toward the continent. So by my end of my second year of university, my compass was set on those objectives.
What were the initial impressions that you had about Africa and its drift from the colonial experience?
Well, it wasn't really a drift. It was a pretty sharp break in some areas. Other areas, it was a pretty smooth transition. In East Africa, and this was really what captured my attention, principally British colonies, and Howard Macmillan's famous speech, "The Winds of Change Are Coming" in 1960, the British understood that it was time to grant independence. So independence was granted through elections and through an electoral process, not multi-party elections, but elections nevertheless. In other parts of the continent, the French, wanted to stay, and they gave some of their colonies a choice to remain close or to disassociate. And so in some instances, like in Guinea, the French just ripped the telephones out and left. But other places like the Belgian Congo, it was a profound disruption and a big conflict. The Portuguese, which had the colonies of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, they had no intentions of leaving whatsoever. And of course, in South Africa and Southern Africa, you had apartheid. And the question of majority rule was just not on the agenda. So this vast continent, all these colonies and countries, to me, was just absolutely fascinating.
So how has the conversation in post-colonialism evolved on the continent? So the experience of either looking back to what might have been before any of these empires came and arrived on the scene, or making up a new story for themselves, a new identity for themselves. What is the legacy that was left that still lingers today, and what was that discovery process like for you?
So for me, it's really quite an interesting question. So for me, as an American looking at Africa, I was conditioned to see Africa as a basket case, as a charity proposition, as a part of the world that we should give aid to, sort of clean your plate at dinner because there are kids in the rest of the world that would love to have what you had. That was sort of my orientation. But as I got into it, began to study it and travel on the continent, I was really captured by the concept of self-determination. I was really captured by the notion that African problems can be and should be solved by Africans. And so, translating that into reality was something else again. And let's face it, these are very young nations. So forging a democracy, developing a foreign policy, trying to have education systems and health systems, security systems, when budgets are quite small and people aren't experienced in managing those budgets, obviously presented very immediate challenges. And militaries were often strong, so there were periods of coups d'etat, such as the one I experienced. And so the first era of self-determination, of independence, was one of governments really trying to establish themselves. But the real turning point, I think, was at the end of the Cold War. During the 70s and during the 80s, African economies had been flat. There'd been negative growth. It was really about dependence, either dependent on the West or dependent on the Soviet Union. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, you began to see civil society emerge. And you began to see governments sort of pulling back from the management of the economies. So the African dynamic got more complex as people wanted more accountability of their governments.
So what does that mean today? So, you described a little bit about what it was like in the beginning and the transition into self-determination. How has that gone in various cases?
So let me mention one experience, and then I'll come to that question. When I was in about early 1990, I had this one job here in Washington with a group called Investor Responsibility Research Center. And my job was to go down to South Africa and check on U.S. companies who were invested there to make sure that they were complying with external codes of conduct, in this case, the Leon H. Sullivan principles and the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. And these principles compelled American companies to integrate the workforce, to integrate changing areas, to pay black workers same wages, equal workers, because there's this big divestment movement going on in the United States, and the companies wanted to be on the right side of history and not disinvest. Big push to have them disinvest. One day I walked onto the shop floor of this company, and the managing director said, look, one day the South African police came onto my shop floor, and they wanted to arrest me for integrating my workplace and for paying black workers the same wages as white workers for the same work. And I had to decide right then, was I going to comply with South African law, or was I going to follow instructions from New York that was telling me to do this? And I decided I was going to follow instructions from New York, the gentleman told me. And that a light bulb went off in my mind, because I saw that in Africa, corporates in the private sector could be agents of change, because those companies that took Sullivan principles seriously were doing a really good job of investing in community, paying legal fees for the children of workers who are protesting apartheid, paying education fees. And, they didn't want to leave. They wanted to be part of the struggle in many respects. So that sort of woke me up to the role of the private sector in Africa. And as I made my journey, as I then went into the Clinton administration, I became very friendly with our Secretary of Commerce, Ron Brown. And he was a big advocate of U.S. investment in Africa. And I became a big advocate of U.S. investment in Africa, because I saw that by and large, American companies wanted to do the right thing on the continent. They didn't want to participate in corruption. They wanted to go there to make a profit. They wanted to go there to train local workers. They didn't want to bring a lot of Americans. They wanted to be part of the governments and the communities in which they were investing. And I frankly became a big advocate of that. So in the Clinton administration, we got something passed through Congress called the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And that lowered to zero the tariffs on some 6,400 products from Africa. And that helped us move away from this donor-recipient relationship that had been so predominant in U.S.-African relations to a relationship based more on mutual benefit and mutual gain, and using trade as a stimulus to economic development.
So this has been a wild debate over the last at least 15 years in development economics, right? You've got on the one hand the pro-aid folks like Jeffrey Sachs, and notably Bono, And then you've also got the folks on the other hand, like the William Easterlys of the world, advocating for getting a few policies right and letting entrepreneurship do its thing. Something has to start somewhere, though. Where did you find yourself landing in those tough debates from your posts in the State Department?
So I always found myself on the private sector side because I thought that was the most sustainable. For me, it's really about helping companies align their commercial objectives with countries' economic development objectives. And by that, I mean, for a company to invest in Africa or anywhere, frankly, it's got to be profitable, right? But in the African context, to be profitable, to be long-term sustainable, it has to be aligned with the country's economic development objectives. Now, virtually every country on the continent has a 2020 strategy or a 2030 strategy. So if you're a healthcare company, you're going to want to read that government's chapter on health priorities. So you can speak the language of the government and you can help align your commercial objectives with what the government's going to try to achieve. And then you start working with local folks who are practitioners in that area, be they medical professionals or NGOs or civil society representatives. And I think if you take that broad strategy as an investment strategy, you're going to be successful, in my view, make a very significant impact. But let me go back to the debate that you well articulated there and just say, I don't think it's either or. There is definitely a role for aid. There's no question about it. The most dramatic example, actually, was the one that Bono was involved in, advocating for spending to combat the HIV/AIDS crisis. And over the course of 24 months, the U.S. played a role in making antiretrovirals available to more than 3 million people on the continent who would otherwise not be there now. And today they are parents. Today they are workers. Today they are civil servants. Today they're entrepreneurs. And that's an example of where aid can play a role and needs to play a role. But I think we have to be ever mindful that the Africa of today is very different from 20, 30, 40 years ago. And there's a great desire for African governments, for African men and women just to control their own destiny and to be self-reliant and to have their own resources and to generate their own resources. And that's where I think, the real opportunity for investment lies, to be part of that.
So tell me, you're really active on the continent and you spend a lot of time there. Seems like when I send you emails, it's 50-50. You're either here or you're in Africa somewhere. What is the Africa of today? Being an India specialist myself, I know that when I talk to people about it, their image of India is like in the 70s or 80s. And, I have to tell them, people buy Bugattis in India. There's a lot of money in India. A lot of folks in the middle part of the income spectrum where they can go and see a movie if they want. How would you characterize the various strata of African society today? What does it look like when you're actually there?
So, I think the common perception here in the U.S. of Africa, just to use an analogy, is, people might think of it as a dial-up continent, like we used to dial up for computer services, put it on your phone, link in. When in my experience, it's really more of a 3G or 4G or 5G continent. And by that I mean, probably the most important statistic, if there's one to choose, there are many to know about, but one to choose comes down to the population, 1.2 billion people. Of that, 70% are 30 years or younger. The median age is 18. So what does that mean? That means Africa is very youthful. there are a lot of young folks on the continent. That can be a blessing. People are very innovative, very creative, very hungry for learning. That is for sure. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who want jobs. And are those jobs going to be there? So the dividend challenge is at one of boomers, at one of bust. And I think that's really the key story on the continent. How to leverage the continent's demographic in such a way that it really contributes to ongoing change. And, Africa has been the locale for just innumerable tragedies. Rwanda maybe being at the top of the list, but there are many others. At the same time, there are just, many successes and many stories of where governments and people and communities and companies and civil society organizations have come together to make a profound difference. And that's what I focus on. I focus on the folks who are making the difference there. And I ask myself, how can I leverage what we have in the United States to be part of that, to learn from it, to contribute to it? And I think that's a really exciting place to be.
I agree. That is a really fun place to be. And it's so cool to hear you talk about what that's been like. So you did it in government, you did it in your own consulting firm. So what's it like now doing it at Covington? I know you probably can't talk too much detail, but what are some of the interesting things that you're able to see and get involved in out there?
So here's the deal, right? So when Covington came to me and said, would you come and join us? I didn't really know Covington from any other law firm in Washington, D.C. I'm an Africanist. I know government, I know companies. I really hadn't focused on it. But as I said before, what really drives me is helping companies align commercial objectives with economic development objectives. What Covington represented was the opportunity to have that conversation, not only with big American corporates, which I was sort of already doing, but companies from Europe going into Africa, companies from India going into Africa, companies from Korea going into Africa, even companies from China going into Africa. If we can get that private sector development paradigm right, it's going to be transformative, and I believe we can. So Covington offered that opportunity, and it's really been quite fascinating. We've done some really interesting projects, and there's one that I can talk about because it's been written about. So 2 years ago, the South African cell phone company, MTN, they're a huge company, about $10 billion market cap, 20% owned by U.S. Pension funds and others. They're in 20 African countries, have more than 200 million customers across the continent. They were hit by this $5.2 billion fine in Nigeria. The Nigerian government in 2011 had put this rule on their books that said cell phone companies have to register purchasers of SIM cards at the point of sale because the government wanted to use this as a way to develop a national identity system. Well, the rule went unenforced from 2011 to 2015, and it also went non-complied with by the telcos. 2015, a new president, 6 months into his tenure, there's a suicide bombing in Abuja. The government finds 3,000 unregistered SIM cards and gives all the telcos a week to register all SIM cards, or there's going to be a $1,000 fine per SIM card. MTN had 5.2 million unregistered SIM cards. They got hit by this $5.2 billion fine. So we're sitting here in Washington watching all this. And MTN was not a client. But we said, we started working our contacts in Johannesburg. Can somebody connect us to MTN? Because I think we can be helpful. So we were connected. We made the pitch. We said, we can help you. And they said, how? We know Africa. They said, what else? So we said, well, we have the former Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, as one of our partners. And Eric has a lot of experience in leveraging big fines, and we can share that experience with the Nigerian government and let them know why this fine is so disproportionate. So we got hired. We went to Nigeria. Eric made the point that when the U.S. fined BP for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, that was a multi-billion-dollar fine, but 8 to 10% of revenue. When the U.S. fined J.P. Morgan for its role in the subprime mortgage crisis, same thing, multi-billion-dollar fine, 8 to 10% of revenue. We pointed out to the government that this fine on MTN Nigeria was 400% of its revenue, and there's no bankruptcy law in Nigeria. So the day that MTN goes out of business, not only would there be 65 million Nigerians with no cell phone service, but how many hundreds of thousands of businesses that are reliant on cell phones would be impacted. And the cell phone and the financial services sector that's cell phone based was the fastest growing sector of the economy. And then plus the signal it would send to any potential investor about investing in Nigeria. So the Nigerian government said, yeah, we get it.
Well, when you put it that way.
Yeah, exactly. So they said, okay, we'll negotiate with MTN through you guys. And it was really quite successful. We got it down to $1.5 billion. MTN agreed to list on the Nigeria Stock Exchange. And it was a win-win outcome. And that's really what we try to do. We try to get that win-win outcome. And if I don't see it at the beginning, we're not going to get involved in the project. But there's got to be an outcome that's good for the company and good for the country and the people which the company is working in.
So I think that also, I mean, first, that's an awesome story, right? Yeah. That must have been so relieving to MTN.
Yeah.
But I think also it points to something that I knew I had to ask you, which everyone has in the back of their minds as they're hearing this, which is, for this entire podcast, we've mostly been talking about it as if it's San Fernando Valley or something like that with a colonial experience. But what is the actual experience of doing business in Africa like today? Is it the way that people think that it is? Is it more difficult in ways they might not expect? Like, what do you coach people to think when they're heading out their first time?
I think here in the States, Julian, let's say you and I are doing business, we meet for the first time, you do a little homework on me, I do a little on you, I come with my product, I say, this is what I want to do, you like it, we cut the deal, you go home, I go home, maybe we do business over a year or two, become friends, and have a long-term business relationship that's successful. It's just the reverse on the continent. You go to the continent, you got to get to know people. They need to know who you are, and you need to know who they are. You don't know. Somebody from Zambia, I mean, you may have been referred, or somebody from South Africa or Kenya. Relationships are the core of the business experience on the continent. So you have to get that relationship right. And a lot of that is understanding who this person is, the context in where they're coming from, what they're trying to achieve, understanding their expectations, aligning their expectations with your expectations. That takes time. So, it's often said that, Americans lead with their notebooks when it comes to Africa. And we do, for very good reasons. We want to make sure who we're doing business with, and same on the other side. So whether it's small business in Kenya that's making bags, or like a big corporate, like you're doing oil project in Nigeria or Angola, you need lead time to get it right. I would say that's the biggest difference.
How much lead time do you kind of need? Is there a rule of thumb or anything like that?
There's no rule of thumb. It was interesting. I'll give you another example. I did a project with Bob Johnson, the founder of BET. And he was at a Clinton Global Initiative in 2006. And he heard President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf make an appeal to American business. I need your help. I need American business, particularly African American business, to help me rebuild Liberia, which was coming out of 15 years of civil war. And Bob responded. He said, I commit to mobilize $30 million. And he came back from New York and contacted some friends and said, I need some help with this. And so I was put in touch, and I went and met him, and he said, I'm going to do this, and I said I'd mobilize $30 million, maybe not all mine, but I'll put in $1 million. And when he said that, I knew I could leverage a lot. So I went out there with another colleague from RLJ Corporate, and we did our due diligence and came back, and Liberia had nothing at that time. So we thought about developing an enterprise fund to help make capital available. And we got that going. U.S. government agency OPIC said, we'll make funding available for the fund. Then President Sirleaf asked Bob to build a hotel, which he did, built the first 4-star hotel in 25 years in the country. And by us going out there regularly with the support of President Sirleaf, with Bob, it really helped to convey the notion, we're here. We're going to make this work. We're not here for a quick buck. We're not here, we're not going to go home tomorrow if we don't get the right answer today. We're going to make this work. We're going to develop those relationships. And I think that paradigm has played out a lot over time. Just making the commitment to invest, figuring it out. You don't always have the support of the president, but, finding the right people, wherever that right person may be, wherever that right man or woman may be. It's really important to have those partnerships.
So how do you handle things like corruption? That's a word that gets brought into the conversation often with, I hear it all the time with India, hear it all the time with Africa, a bunch of other places too, but it seems that's also something that's on folks' mind when they head out there. What's the best way to deal with that?
Straight ahead, straight on. American companies have one answer when it comes to corruption, and that's no, we don't do it because we've got the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But when I came to Covington, this great law firm, I said to myself, I don't want it just to be an anti-corruption play. That's what I said to myself, because the Africa space is so much broader than that, so much more dynamic than that. However, as I got to know the firm's capability, I saw that it had a tremendous capability in compliance and helping companies set up systems to combat corruption so that employees would not succumb to corruption. And they knew the difference between, when a police officer says, a rural police officer says, I need $25 to fill my tank of gas, the difference between I need $25 before I even answer your call, because he probably does need $25 for gas. So a lot of what we do, frankly, now, it's one of our main areas, is helping financial institutions on the continent put in place those compliance systems to make sure that they're compliant with U.S. law, to make sure they're compliant with UK law, increasingly French law. There's just been this experience in South Africa of the Guptas and companies that got involved with the Guptas, brand companies, McKinsey, KPMG,
Mention just really quick the Guptas issue.
Sorry, the Guptas. So for the last 10 years, former President Zuma of South Africa, got involved with this Indian family and didn't really care about corruption. Corruption ran rife. There was a report that the parliament did entitled State Capture. State capture by the Guptas of different ministries and parastatals and putting in place different individuals who were loyal to not South African national interests, but the interests of a few who wanted to get wealthy at the expense of others. Last December, there was a change in party election in the African National Congress. Cyril Ramaphosa was elected. And Cyril Ramaphosa is a tremendously experienced guy, tremendous businessman. He was with Nelson Mandela. He helped to negotiate the Constitution. He was a trade union leader. He brings tremendous credentials to the presidency now and is helping to put the country back on the right footing of accountability, of transparency, of people getting the right returns for the investments that they make. So going back to what we do, we can play a role in that because we can help those companies protect themselves from U.S. Justice Department, the reach of the U.S. Justice Department. Because if you're a major company and you're doing business in dollars and it's going through the U.S. banks, all of a sudden you become vulnerable to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So any corruption has to be seen as part of the whole process for better governance on the continent, better elections, more accountability, more transparency. So the degree that we can play a role in that, I'm all there. We're all there.
So, amen. Hallelujah. It's the first, it's one of the first things that I hear from people is stuff like that about corruption. And, the next thing that people usually say, and I think that this is probably more common in Africa than it is in India, is does that put us at a disadvantage? Because the Chinese can roll up with a bunch of money and they don't have those same kinds of, although it seems to be changing a little bit with this spirit of anti-corruption in China, but it still doesn't feel as institutional as it is here.
I think it's a tremendous asset, to be honest with you, just to be inoculated against corruption. Say no. If you start going down that path, then the inefficiencies multiply. Take out the moral dimension, but once you start paying off people, it's just never ending. So I think we're actually empowered by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and not only. But
you're saying that it doesn't put us at a disadvantage in getting deals against the Chinese or things like that.
I think our competitive issues with the Chinese, that's part of it. It's just a small part of the story. What it does do is it makes American companies very desirable on the continent. What I get from African leaders is, why aren't we seeing more U.S. investment? We like doing business with you guys. We like the way you respect labor standards. We like the way you respect environmental standards. We like the way that you train local people, that you promote local people, that you invest in communities. We like the fact that you're connected to global supply chains and you produce here and you export. We want to see more American investment.
So what do they ask you for? Who do they want and what do they want and what generates a lot of excitement? Like there was a period when I went to India and they said, Julian, just please bring Chipotle. But what really wins in Africa? What's hot?
Nike. American brands are really strong.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question about it. And, again, another example of a project I worked on here at Covington with Microsoft. Microsoft has been in Africa 20 years, right? And several years ago, they created a For Africa initiative to connect more directly with the youth population. I came to Covington. We do a lot of work with Microsoft. The head of the Africa practice came to see me, said, "Can you help us? We're on the continent, but we want to get more involved." And I said, "Well, have you heard about the Obama administration? They've created this initiative called the Young Africa Leaders Initiative, where they're going to bring 500 of the best and brightest to the United States for for 6 weeks of leadership training and a week in Washington of summit with President Obama and other senior officials in the government. They said, no, we haven't heard about it. So I said, okay, let's go to the White House and talk about YALI, as it's known. And so we went over there, and after a 2-hour conversation, Microsoft was so excited about this because they saw it as a way to sort of delve more deeply in the youth population. U.S. government was excited because here's this blue chip U.S. company coming on board that gives credibility. But where it got really interesting was when USAID put the application online for the first class of 500 fellows, and 50,000 young Africans applied for those 500 slots. Wow. So, yeah, it was, wow, the power of this program. And here's Microsoft sort of right there and a couple of other companies. And we realized that we tapped into something quite powerful. So Microsoft responded and they said, we'll give 100 internships in Africa to anybody in that first class of 500 who are interested. And it just, that kind of public-private partnership was just transformative. Transformative for Microsoft, transformative for government, exciting as hell for me to, have been part of. And yeah, that's what we try to do around here.
See, folks need to know there's fun stuff to do in Washington. Yeah. So what do young African folks aspire to? Like, what's the hot job? What's the good life in young Africa?
Yeah. Well, not being young and certainly not being a young African, I'm not quite probably the best person to talk about it, but I can just talk about what I see. And I think, the young folks I connect with, they want to innovate. They want to fulfill their own dreams and goals, and their dreams and goals are large and vast and transformative. They want life in Africa to be better for them than it was for their parents, although they're deeply respectful of their parents. They want more accountability. They want more democracy. They want to innovate. Technology is huge. Take a country like Kenya, which is not just an African leader, it's the global leader in mobile-based financial services. I mean, today, if you're an average Kenyan, you can buy a bond, buy into a Kenyan bond for like $20 over your cell phone, and you don't even need a bank account. And that $20 bond is going to generate interest and returns over 3 years. So there's a lot of innovation going on, and that I think most young Africans want to be part of, and they want to be charting their own destiny, and they want partnerships. They want to drive their own agenda, and I think that creates a whole lot of opportunity for other folks who want to partner.
Do you think that I can probably imagine your answer, but what do you think people are really missing out on when it comes to Africa? Maybe because the media seems to always want to put a sad story on things, or perpetuate kind of the aid industry's vision of Africa rather than young, vibrant Africa.
Yeah.
What's the deal there?
So here's the deal. This is how I think about it. If you stop and ask yourself, what are the top 10 issues in the world today? Everybody's got a different list. Climate change might be on the list. More democracy might be on the list. Fighting of liberalism, more diversity might be on the list. A host of issues. Everybody has their own list. But I would think that on many lists would be accelerated economic development on the African continent. What happened in China 20 years ago and 30 years ago is you saw this tremendous exodus from absolute poverty into the middle class. That's happening in Africa today. It's not quite as fast, and given that there are 54 countries on the continent, it's much more diluted. but it's happening. And to be part of that, by introducing business practices, by making investments, by strengthening women entrepreneurs, there are many, many ways to be part of that tremendously exciting process of this continent that is taking its rightful place, not just in the global economy, but in the world writ large.
Mm. So I think another thing that kind of flew underneath the radar, I don't know why it wasn't picked up, was this new trade agreement, massive trade agreement that is it the entire African continent or most of it?
It is. It's the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's been assigned by 44 countries. Nigeria has not committed to it yet. It needs 22 countries to ratify it before it goes into force. But it's a very significant development because what it does is that it says that these 54 countries, there are going to be no tariffs. Tariffs will be reduced on 90% of products going back and forth. It's going to be easier for people to move across borders. It's going to be easier for goods and services to move across borders. And so African businesses can start marketing to African consumers in a much broader way, in much easier way. The distance from Cape Town to Johannesburg is 1,000 miles. It will take a truck full of goods 17 hours to get from Cape Town to Johannesburg. The distance from Johannesburg to Lusaka is also 1,000 miles. It'll take that same truck 5 days to cross borders. So the Continental Free Trade Agreement.
That's not terrain or anything. That's just
not terrain. It's borders.
Wow.
It's hassles. It's
And Lusaka is Zambia.
Zambia.
Just
you got to go
one country away.
Yeah,
right?
you got to Botswana and Zimbabwe and others. So you've got to cross a number of borders, and there's always blocks. Maybe the border isn't open 24 hours. So what the Continental Free Trade Agreement is going to do is to help make that journey from Johannesburg to Lusaka, turn it down to 2 days or a day and a half. That's what we're dealing with. It's going to take time. CAFTA is not going to be implemented overnight, but there's a consensus about regional economic integration.
That's awesome. So movement of goods is going to be a big issue there, obviously. What else?
Movement of goods, movement of services, visas, will be much easier to get. East Africa, I think you don't need a visa if you're East African to go from Uganda to Tanzania to Rwanda.
Well, this is I think this is going to be a big deal for companies there, right?
Promises to be.
So we've got a bunch of bright spots on Africa right now. You've mentioned Kenya a couple of times. I know that Ethiopia has had some good news lately. What else is looking good? How's Angola?
Angola, they've got new leadership there. And they're looking, it's really quite encouraging that President João Lourenço has, put in place widespread reforms. Previous president's daughter was head of the national oil company. He fired her literally within the first 2 months of his service. Same with the son, and bringing more professional leadership of these critical state-owned, state-run companies. So that's encouraging. The leadership change in South Africa that I mentioned is quite encouraging. We're waiting to see the elections in Zimbabwe, July 23, later this month, how they go. You referenced the change in Ethiopia. Peace was just announced between Ethiopia and Eritrea after 20 years of bitter warfare. Ethiopia can now use Eritrea's port, which is its closest port. And Ethiopia is a country, it's the second largest country on the continent, about 100 million people, which is already growing at about 8.5–9%. And with the reforms that President Abe has announced with the banking sector and the telecommunications sector, I would keep your eye on Ethiopia.
What about some of the smaller countries or less frequently discussed countries like Zambia?
Yeah, they're still, I think they're struggling, to get more attention, to break out of their reliance on single commodities. That's clearly a problem on the continent. Zambia is very dependent on copper, and it can be hard to diversify. And Malawi is, again, a smaller country that's agriculture-based. Namibia is another very interesting country that has a lot of diamonds and other minerals, but is also looking to diversify. It's got a good track record on governance. So there are a number of countries that are worth taking a close look at. I mean, there are obvious challenges there. The DRC, the lack of change there, conflict in the east, Central African Republic conflict there continues. Somalia is quite a difficult issue.
So looking back at all of this, the experiences you've had in these countries, the things that you've seen, the adventures that you've been on, we're sitting in a really cool office in Washington, but I'm sure that there have been lots of memories racing through your head of all the things that you've gone and done. Was this what you wanted when you made that little promise to yourself that you wanted to do this? Have you had the fun you want?
I feel so fortunate for the path I took, leaving the kibbutz and going down to Kenya. It all started there. But it was really quite interesting when I got out of the Clinton administration. I spent 20 years trying to get there, right? And I got there. I never thought I would. And it
was as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, right?
Correct,
right.
Correct. And I was responsible for economic and commercial issues across the continent, had regional responsibility for Southern Africa. President Clinton took the first substantive trip by a U.S. president to the continent. He went to 6 countries in 12 days. The issues of losing our embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam are real. We got the African Growth and Opportunity Act passed, which put the U.S.-African commercial relationship on a new footing. So it was really quite go-go. We accomplished a lot, and then it was over. Now what do I do? And I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to do a career change, this is the time to do it. But I thought to myself, Africa is getting more interesting, not less interesting. I'm going to stick with this. And, I couldn't see a job in Washington that I wasn't going to get fired from in 12 months because I just wanted to work in Africa. So that's led me to my consulting practice and surprises of all surprises to Covington. It was never in my mind to work in a law firm, but to use this as a base to help companies invest, to help the economic development process across the continent, to still be a voice for strong U.S.-African relations. I feel really fortunate to be here.
Got anything else on your list that you wanna see, do?
I do want to write a book about all this stuff.
You have to. You started this podcast with a bang.
Yeah. So that's still on my list. And the other thing on my list is to make sure that there are a whole host of other Americans and others who are doing this in their careers. That's really what it's all about.
Well, I think that if people listen to this podcast, they might get a step closer to that.
I would be grateful for that.
Thank you so much for making time for this, Witney. I know that you're always doing really cool and interesting things, and I really appreciate you taking out the time.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Thanks for coming over, and really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to find out more about our events and get more global intel every week, sign up for our newsletter at getglobal.co.